Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome back to another new episode of The Lager Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbock Brewing. I'm Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, a contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. As always, I'm joined by Paulo Alves, our co-host out of Portugal. We've also got a special guest today. It's Nathan Grubel, who you may know as Draft Deeper on Twitter/X. Nathan, let's start with introductions. Tell our audience a little bit about your time in NBA draft media and generally what you do when it comes to creating draft-related content.
Sure. So, Ben, Paulo, thank you guys so much for having me on the podcast, and I really appreciate it. But most people would know me in terms of being the founder of Draft Deeper, which started independently as its own podcast, expanded into more written form content when I was with the No Ceilings team, as well as kept the podcast going over there, the Draft Deeper podcast. But that media career that started back in 2020 up through this past year, 2023, that was actually something that came from me having experience and wanting to get into the scouting industry dating back to 2011. I was trying my hands at NBA draft scouting, and naturally I went to college, did a lot of stuff in the NBA media space with a few different websites, but then really pursued the scouting industry as a whole by working with a private firm, EB Hoops at the time. Naturally made some relationships with some other scouts and executives in the space and some agents. And in doing that, I really wanted to be able to share a lot of the lessons that I learned, as well as continue to scout publicly, which is why Draft Deeper was formed. It was a very successful podcast. And thankfully, I'm going to be launching a new website/newsletter called Youth Movement in September of 2024, which will focus a lot more, not just on the draft, but as the NBA in terms of young players, the G League, guys who could potentially come back to the league as a whole. So that's going to be a really exciting project to get into. But yeah, everything always leads back to the draft, right, guys?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that's what we're going to be talking about today, because the Rockets picking third overall, exactly 2 weeks. We're recording this on Wednesday night, June 12th. The first round is on June 26th. So we're getting pretty close. Still not very clear what the Rockets are going to do or who's going to be on the board at pick 3. So I want to start with the 30,000-foot view question, because Nathan, as you mentioned, you've been around this business for a while. You've seen a number of draft classes, and I think everyone knows the 2024 class does not have a Wemby. There's no perceived generational talent like last year. And so there's been some comparisons to subpar draft classes like the year 2000, 2013. I can remember a lot of people didn't like 2020, but then that reminds me, hey, 2020, even though it wasn't perceived as a good draft class, there have been some really top shelf players that have come out of that. Anthony Edwards and LaMelo Ball in the top 3. You had Tyrese Halliburton, Desmond Bane, Tyrese Maxey later in the first round. You look at 2013, you had to go a little bit deeper in the round, but you had Giannis and Rudy Gobert. And those were a couple of drafts that going in weren't really believed to be all that good and had a lot of the same talk that you hear now about the 2024 draft class. So what are your thoughts about this class as a whole, particularly from the perspective of a team picking very high like the Rockets?
So I think when we discuss the 2024 NBA draft class, I know that it's the popular opinion online to talk about how there's a bit of star power at the very top of the draft, players who we would perceive as a number one pick in previous years. No, there's no Victor Wembanyama in this class. There may not even be a Paolo Banchero potentially in this class. But what we do have is honestly a depth of a number of players who I think are going to have potential starting level careers in the NBA. They're going to be able to come off the bench and play important roles for NBA teams, potentially playoff and contending teams in the near future here. There's a lot of players who, when we evaluate them, no, they may not be these do-it-all offensive engines, but they can contribute defensively in a certain role. They can contribute offensively in a certain role. I think that's the type of player that we're going to see throughout this draft. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because the more that you look at a lot of these playoff teams that are building for contention, you need depth everywhere you can get it, right? You can't just have 2 or 3 guys are the foundation of your team, but your cupboard's bare underneath them, right? You need to have 4th and 5th starters who can do a variety of different things, contribute in certain areas, to where if the star player's having an off night, you have some of these other guys you can lean on. You need 6th, 7th, 8th guys off of your bench, and you even need depth past that in the regular season, depending on the kind of injuries that you encounter, etc. So when we're looking at this draft class, no, there might not be the sexy names at the top, but there is a lot of opportunity for smart teams to certainly improve upon their depth, find some 3rd, 4th, 5th starters, and really find pieces that they're going to be able to build with into the future, whether they have those star pillars already or they're still going to be looking for them in the 25 or 26 draft classes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you did a really good job of, just, of course, not I'm no longer the neutral, but if I were the neutral, obviously I feel pretty inspired by your description. I mean, you made, the low star power label sound like a pretty exciting deal. That being said, there's, I'll get straight to the point. Today, last couple of days, but today especially, there's been more and more talk about the possibility of the Hawks either trading down or even just, if they can, just selecting Clingan at 1. Usually it's 2 weeks from the draft, even though this draft class is not that high, or it's not generating as much buzz. There's always, the media game that teams play. The question just becomes, how likely or unlikely is it that the top 2 shakes off Sarr, Ricochet, or the opposite? How likely is it that the Rockets may get one of the 2 guys that were perceived as the clear top 2 picks, or not really clear, but you know what I mean, up to this point, that one of them falls to 3? Is it close enough to, can you see a team, the Hawks or the Wizards, letting one of those guys slide to 3? And if so, should the Rockets take that guy? Because, I mean, depending on who you ask, that top 2 is not that clear.
So Sarr's been the number 1 overall player on my board since its first iteration. At end of January, beginning of February was when I created my first board that I was sharing privately to the scouts and executives and agents behind the scenes. He has remained in that spot. I have not been as high as Ricochet throughout this process. Zachary Ricochet has certainly had some ups and downs this season. I think he did end the season on a relatively positive note. Him and Tidjane Salaam have also had some good moments overseas. But when we're talking about a player like Alex Sarr, it's important to evaluate not just the number production, but just looking at his tape and looking at what he can offer on the court, because the NBL experience this season for a number of players, not just him, was a little bit sporadic, right? Not everyone had a consistent role in that league. Not everyone was playing every single night. You even had a prospect as talented as Sarr have, one night he's playing 20 minutes or 25 minutes, the next night he's playing 5 minutes and riding the bench. So that was an inconsistent experience for a lot of prospects over there. But when you did get to see him on tape, especially when we saw him in those exhibitions against the G League Ignite team, you saw him take over the game at times as a face-up scoring threat, someone who can knock down shots in the mid-range, someone who is improving consistently as a three-point shooter. He's certainly willing to take those types of jump shots. I think that's going to bode well for him, because when you look at the rest of his package, right, he's 7'1", and an athletic marvel at that center position, someone who reliable finisher in transition, someone who can get up there, catch lobs, finish over top of defenders. You start to put some of that offensive package together along with probably the most enticing part of his game, which is how much ground he's able to cover defensively on the perimeter, how he's able to switch and operate in a switchable scheme, how he's going to be an impactful defender in a number of different coverages in terms of pick and roll defense. You take a look at that type of player and you can say, well, he has some warts. He wasn't a top shelf rebounder in competition. He's someone who's definitely going to need to add some strength and some size to his frame to be able to compete with some of the other big men that he's going to face off against in the NBA. The jump shot is something that's coming around, but it's not there yet. You piece away some of those layers, but when you start to look at too much of the negative, you're wiping away way too much of the positive, which is that Alex Sarr is that type of prospect who you don't really see come into the league much often at all. And the more that we're evaluating and watching NBA basketball at the highest of levels, the more that you become enticed to take an impact defender like Sarr can potentially be. And so that's why if he wouldn't go one to the Hawks, I don't see him falling past the Washington Wizards because they need more on the defensive side of the ball. They need more of the front court. They need help. Anything that they can get out of that center position, someone who they can build around or build with for the future, I don't see them passing on Sarr. I know Clingan may be an intriguing option, but when you factor in what Sarr can do offensively and what he could become, like an Evan Mobley-like kind of player, I don't see the Wizards passing on that at all. Risa Shea is a different story. He's been number 1 or number 2 for ESPN and Jonathan Givony and Jeremy Wu for a while. You've heard some of the rumors that he may slide back and may potentially be in play at 3. I got to be honest, I'd be very intrigued with how he would fit with the Houston Rockets. And when I say that, I know that every single team is looking for these 6'8", 6'9" guys who can shoot threes and they have good feet. They can flip their hips and keep up with guys on the perimeter. But when we're talking about a guy playing on the wing with the guys who the Rockets already have on the roster, right? You signed Dylan Brooks to that contract. You still have Jalen Green there. You just drafted Amen Thompson, who can slide anywhere between the 1 and the 3, and offensively has played the role of like a 4 or a 5, depending on the lineup constructs. You already have guys like Tari East and Cam Whitmore. A lot of these players I'm actually very high on as an evaluator. I think they certainly have a future with the Houston Rockets. So how many of those players would Risa Shea actually play over in terms of the number of minutes that he would have in the rotation? It's not that Risa Shea won't be a good player in the NBA and can't provide value because of what he's bringing to the table. I'm just trying to figure out what is the best use of that asset for the Houston Rockets specifically. Can they find some good guard depth? Can they bolster the center position in the front court? Can they possibly move that pick in some sort of deal where they're picking up other assets or they're getting an impact player back? That's what I'm more so thinking about for the Houston Rockets, not necessarily just trying to take quote-unquote best player available, depending on what we've been hearing.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm with you in the sense that I'm kind of wishing that he, goes top 2, just because I know you don't draft for fit, but obviously the Rockets have a lot of talent at that position, and there are a lot of prospects that if they were in the draft right now, I would draft over Risa Shea. That being said, just a quick follow-up. Since we're probably not going to touch on Sarr anymore on the pod, how do you feel him? You talked about Evan Mobley, so I guess the question still applies. As more of a 4, more of a 5, his fit with Şengün, because personally, I think he's one of if the Rockets were able to either move up, or if the Hawks are not that sold on him, or if he falls, I think he's, if not built in a lab, as close to it as you can without being, Chet Holmgren or someone like that, to play next to a big like Şengün who has some mobility issues and has some rim protection issues. How do you think they'd fit together? And long term, do you see Sarr optimized more as a 4 or as a 5?
I think long term he would be best optimized as a 5, and I think in that position, if they were to draft him, he would be coming off the bench behind Şengün. Not that they couldn't share the court together. I do think they could because of how Sarr tends to favor in terms of facing up on the perimeter, and he's more often used as a player away from the basket or someone who's finishing in transition as a lob threat, not someone who you're calling for a heavy diet of he's going to roll to the basket in the half court or he's going to be someone who's posting up, because those are deficiencies in his game he didn't really get to show a lot of in the NBL, right? He had low possession counts for both of those play types respectively. So you are looking at him more as a rim runner who can also space the floor and then cover a lot of ground defensively in time from the 5 position. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing if you're looking for someone who can play not just next to Şengün in terms of you're looking for him to play heavy minutes together, but also just to bolster that depth behind Alperen Şengün, because there are questions for the Rockets about who's going to be that next center, right? Jock Landale actually did have some moments where he looked pretty good in some limited action at some different points throughout the season. You traded for Steven Adams. You have him at least for this season, you would think, unless they're going to use that contract in the trade to move off of him. I mean, I don't know what direction the Rockets are going to go, but we're looking at these teams around the NBA that are so focused on size and having multiple guys that you can throw at teams, not just relying on one center to play the lion's share of the minutes. And so in that case, I don't think it would be a bad thing for them to draft Sarr. regardless of how often you're seeing him and Şengün share the floor together, at least to offer some sort of depth and a quote-unquote change-up pitch behind Şengün, because they're both obviously playing two different styles at that center spot, right? So I don't think it would be a bad thing. And worst-case scenario, Sarr would become a piece that valuable to move off of to another team and another deal. So these are all the questions I'm sure that Stone and the front office are thinking about as they're looking at what do they do with the third overall pick. And, everyone's talking about Reed Sheppard and how he could be the popular mock at that third spot. You can't rule other options off the table depending on how the draft plays out.
Yeah, your latest mock draft, and we should clarify that you published this on June 1st, and it's based on what you would do, not your final prediction of what the teams would do. But if you were the Rockets, you actually have them picking Donovan Clingan at 3, which has intrigued me. It does not intrigue Paulo so much, and he could issue a rebuttal if he wants to. But I'm a Clingan guy. I do not see how he misses. He has a clear skill set that will play in the NBA. It's something the Rockets don't really have on this team. To an extent, they have it with Steven Adams, but I don't think you should let a guy who's now in his 30s on basically a one-year contract dictate what you do with an asset as high as number 3 overall in the draft. So if Clingan's on the board, I'm not saying for sure he would be my guy, but in a draft where there is a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of appeal to a guy who can step in and even if it's in just a 15 to 20 minutes per game role behind Alperen Şengün, he can do some things year 1, year 2 that help you in the very near term as you're trying to take that next step into the playoffs. And even if long term he ends up somewhat blocked because of the presence of Alperen Şengün, and let's say Şengün does become an all-star, he gets that next contract and he looks like he's going to be your starter at center for the next 10 years. Even if that happens, worst case, if Clingan pans out the way I think he will, then his role should be very projectable, and he's someone that worst case you could trade a couple of years from now and would still have pretty good value if it looks like, he's capped at 20 minutes per game here because of maybe he can't defend in the perimeter well enough, maybe neither guy, Clingan or Şengün, develops a three-point shot well enough. We all know the questions. Worst case, even if those aren't resolved, then I think if he's the best player available, I'd rather just have to trade him later on than take a guy who isn't as good of a player, but I think is a better fit in year 1 or year 2. So that's my rationale for Clingan. Nathan, what are your thoughts on why he could make sense for the Rockets, even though they have Alperen Şengün right now?
Well, first of all, Ben, I think you hit a lot of that analysis right on the head. That was certainly well done by you in explaining that. I would echo a lot of those points. And the one thing I think I would add to that, and the reason why I went with Clingan in that particular mock is, look, we understand Sarr, Shea, maybe you have a wild card in there, maybe like a Modest Buzelis or a Stephon Castle who could possibly be in play for Washington too. We don't know what they're going to do yet, but regardless, to me, it seems fairly likely that the Rockets are going to have, again, if they're on the board at number 3, they don't move off of that pick, they're going to have a choice of Donovan Clingan or Reed Sheppard, right? Mm-hmm. So I know Reed Sheppard's been a very popular mock, and I'm a big Reed Sheppard guy. I'm not opposed to the Rockets potentially taking Reed Sheppard at all. I think where I would hesitate would be, in my opinion, if you're going to use that high of a pick on someone like Reed Sheppard, you better be giving him the runway to actually further develop his skills past just viewing him as this off-ball shooter who can also step in, maybe occasionally touch the ball in some primary possessions, and then you're looking at what he's doing for you defensively in terms of creating a little off-ball havoc, playing passing lanes, getting his hands on a few block shots. If you don't think Reed Sheppard has a long runway in the NBA as a point guard, you're not willing to develop him and give him that leash in that regard, I would just allocate that asset elsewhere, to be perfectly honest with you. I would make another pick. I would look at someone like Donovan Clingan, who, Ben, like I said, you did a great job of outlining his value, but just taking a look at that archetype in general, that type of big man who you could have for 4 years on a rookie contract at bare minimum, potentially extend him, have him on your team, have him as someone who is playing behind Alperen Şengün. Maybe he's filling in for Şengün if Şengün gets hurt. We saw Şengün have an injury towards the end of this past year. Who says that won't happen again? Having someone like Donovan Clingan who's reliable, you can count on him, you know what he's bringing to the table. That size on that type of rookie scale contract, to me, is potential better use of that asset compared to drafting a number of other guys who either aren't as clean of a fit with the rest of the personnel on this roster, or you're having them come in and play a role that doesn't necessarily play to them developing in terms of the upside they might have. Because, I mean, I can ask you guys know the Rockets a lot better than I do. You're watching every single game. I'm not watching every single game. You have Fred VanVleet already on the roster. He's been fine as a point guard for this team. He was a leader. You kind of got what you expected to get out of him this year. But then you also have Amen Thompson, who you're going to want to have the ball in his hands a lot in terms of running the offense and seeing how he can develop as a point guard. You have other wings like a Jalen Green still on the roster who you also want, continuing to get pick and roll reps and having their impact within the offense. If Reed Sheppard's drafted to the Houston Rockets, do you guys even think that he would get that runway to develop his skill as a point guard, and that would be his role in terms of taking on more of the creation aspects and setting the table for others rather than just you're having to come off a few screens or having to run a few sets of floppy catching and shooting?
I think some of that is intertwined with Amen Thompson and where he's at. I think his rookie year was really interesting. By and large, it was an encouraging one, but Amen was not nearly as polished with his handle, with his point guard skills as a lot of us expected. The good news is that he was superb off the ball. He was incredible. And I think a lot of us didn't expect, especially in year one, where you worry about a lot of rookies having awareness issues, not being smart enough, not processing quickly enough. He had the point guard processing, even if he didn't have the handle, just in terms of how he is able to anticipate, to see the floor. And so because of that, he functioned really well as a 3, as a 4, even a small ball 5 at times out of the dunker slot as something of a lob threat. And so that was really useful to the Rockets. I think in time, they would love to get him back to that point guard of the future mold that I think they envisioned when they drafted him a year ago. But I think at least in the short term, because there's still some developing to be done with his handle and his point guard skills, then there's something of a role for Reed Sheppard. The thing for me, I'm open to Reed if you think he can be that next Fred VanVleet. We had Brian Kalbrowski on a few weeks ago, and he actually compared Reed to Fred, and I could see that from the perspective of their games, and I think Fred, in that sense, would be an ideal mentor for Reed. And so you could see sort of the template for the Rockets, and Fred only has one more guaranteed year left on his contract, so potentially Reed could fill that role in time. It's just, for me, too much of the discourse, at least on Twitter, on Clutch Fans, on Reddit, that I read regarding Reed Sheppard is about the shooting when it should be about the totality of his game. You mentioned the other elements. Can he develop as a point guard? What is his on-ball defense going to be like? Can you mitigate his, I don't want to say height limitations, because it's not like he's short, but he's certainly not big by any means, 6'3", 180 pounds. So there are some limitations there. How well does he move side to side, lateral quickness, those types of questions. For me, it's the totality of the package, because people look at the Rockets and say, okay, this is a team that, especially out of the All-Star break last year, shoots a lot of threes, but the accuracy was below average. So we need more shooting. Here's the thing. The Rockets already have a full 9-man rotation as it is. So if you just want Reed Sheppard for spacing, it's not going to make that much of an impact when you're already playing 9 guys in front of him. And quite frankly, if you just want to add a shooter, you can go sign Buddy Hield or Malik Beasley, someone like that, with your non-taxpayer mid-level exception. So this pick should not be made simply because he's a shooter. And Rafael Stone made the point as well when he was asked about shooting earlier this offseason. He pointed to the internal guys, and he didn't use names, but most notably he's talking about Jalen Green, Cam Whitmore, to some extent Jabari Smith, guys that internally should get better as they mature because their shot selection is going to improve. Rafael's point is that it's not that guys like Jalen and Cam and Jabari can't shoot. Well, Jabari's shooting a respectable clip already, but the idea is that all of them are going to get better as they mature because they're going to take better shots, and because they're taking better shots, they're going to get higher percentages. That's naturally how guys evolve over their first few years in the league. And so the Rockets do need to shoot better, but I think it's, as how the team sees it, it's less about, okay, this is a clear need we need to bring in, and it's more the guys we have internally are going to have to get better as shooters for us to take that next step as a team. So that's where I'm at with Reed. It's not so much that I'm not open to him. I think some people on social media think that I'm anti-Reed. No, I'm not at all. I'm very open to him. It's just, it's more about the other elements of his game, because you shouldn't bring him in just because he's a shooter. You should bring him in because you believe in his skills defensively, as a point guard, as a facilitator, as a creator. It's about the other aspects of its game. And it feels like that, you're high on him in some of those areas, but it's just you need to have a plan to develop him and to, give him some runway to develop those skills the next couple of years. Is that a fair characterization?
No, that's 100% where I'm at. And if that's not the plan, then again, if all you're looking for is Reed to play that shooter-specific role, I mean, you like you said, you can find someone with that mid-level exception. You can find someone out of the G League to play similar minutes. But how many guys are you finding in free agency right now who are 7'2" who just came off of dominant rim protection seasons for a two-time national champion who bring things, known quantities to the table that are based around that size, which is something we know wins in the NBA. You're not finding that as often or as easily as you may think. So that was the reason behind why I went with Clingan in my mock. You hit it right on the nose, Ben.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, you're not gonna find someone as high or that values rim protection quite as much, or you're not gonna find many people that value it more than I do. And people have come after me for years in Rockets fandom because of my worries about Sengun and rim protection, obviously. So it doesn't take much to convince me to take a rim protecting big. It takes a lot to convince me that rim protecting big is ever going to be able to play without Sengun. And if you're going to spend, in my opinion, right, if you're going to spend the number 3 draft pick on a big, and you're going to stuff him behind your team's current best player, which is the truth, Alfred Sengun is the team's current best player. To me, not only is that, after establishing that I have no hope whatsoever that he'll ever be able to play with Sengun, both sole-footed, neither of them can even remotely switch onto the perimeter. On offense, even if you bought that either Sengun's probably more likely than Clingan, but even if you bought that Clingan can develop a 3-point shot, that's obviously a long shot considering his free throw percentage, considering everything. Doesn't matter what shows up in random workout videos in the offseason. We've learned with that. It's the 4th year of the rebuild, guys. We know that those are not real. Even if you believe that Sengun would be the one to learn how to shoot, even then, I'm not sure how much value that would bring, even offensively, having those two together, because you ideally want Auburn Sengun to be the one in the post, making the decisions out of the post, being the pick that's playing inside. So ideally, it would actually have to be Clingan that develops into that. So I'm not against drafting Clingan. I'm against a long-term view of the team that includes both Clingan and Sengun. And then I can already see what the discussions are going to be like in a year from now.
Well, Paulo, I guess my only counter to that would be who else are you picking at that third spot who's actually going to claim a starting spot, who's going to play a lot of minutes next to Sengun as it is, regardless of what position they're playing. As Ben laid out, and I'd agree with him, this is a deep rotation as it is with a lot of young players who, quite frankly, have a right to start on a lot of teams in the NBA, but they're not going to be starting for this Houston Rockets squad. A lot of guys who I'm still high on. So I get the nervousness about wanting the front court mate to, or someone drafted in the front court to be able to play with Sengun, but who's taking Jabari Smith's job, for example? Who's taking Cam Whitmore, Tari Easton, or Amen Thompson's job? Who's taking Jalen Green's job? Who's taking Fred VanVleet or Dylan Brooks's job? Like that to me is what I'm looking at with this third overall pick. And in my opinion, if you're using this pick, you're looking to actually add to this team from a depth perspective. And then depending on other moves that can shake out during this season around the trade deadline or after this next upcoming season, then maybe we're talking about who's actually going to take one of those starting spots that could be up for grabs if guys are moved or they're not on the team altogether. But right now, I think you are looking at it from a depth perspective. So who else are you looking at, Paulo, with that third pick, who you think could crash and get into that minutes parade right away?
So I'm 100% with you. I don't think that any guy that they draft in this spot is likely to just jump into the starting lineup. Even just jumping into the rotation would be questionable. But to me, and I've touched on this, I think 2 or 3 pods ago, it's about having a realistic path towards that role opening up, right? Alperen Sengun is a staple of this team. At least that's currently constructed. Obviously, if you go into my history, you'll obviously find scenarios where he's not, but let's assume that he is. Amongst the young core, he's probably, besides Amen Thompson, the guy that's most likely to be here long term. Or Tyrese is not really a core piece, he fits with everyone. But of the core, superstar potential type of players, he's one of the most likely to be here, and he hamstrings your team building options, right? So he cannot play with Clingan, and it's in the foreseeable future he won't be able to play with a guy like Clingan. So you're eventually going to have to make the choice. My personal favorite pick at number 3, and I'll preface it by telling you, like I've told the audience a few times, I don't think that there's an ideal pick here. I think these guys should all be drafted 7 or 8 in a normal draft. But my pick is Reed Sheppard because I think that year 1, there's a possibility that he could play. I think he could play minutes with the second unit next to him and thumbs up as the main ball handler because I don't think Amanda's there yet. And I think that there's a realistic path that if not in year 1, because injuries happen, so that could be one of the ways he gets there. But if not in year 1, Fred VanVleet is on a 2-year deal with a team option. If the coaching staff thinks that Reed Sheppard is good enough, there's a very easy path to either promoting Aman Thompson into the starting lineup and having Reed Sheppard be the third guard off the bench, or I think that there's a lot of parallels between Reed Sheppard's game and what Fred VanVleet did as a support the Rockets in the pick and roll with Sengun being able to punish drop coverage. I think he'd even be better at finishing at the rim than Fred VanVleet is because that's a clear weakness. I think we'd give up a little bit on the defensive end as I said in previous spots, but I think there's a very clear vision of what instituting Reed Sheppard, if you look at it as a 3-year plan, looks like, as opposed to, and I think you have to at least have that. And with Clingan, there's a hard ceiling called Operation Sengun that you're never going to be able to break. And yes, I do get that if you hit the pick, you can always trade the guy later. But the guy's trade value is also always going to have a glass ceiling because he's not a starter, and there's someone on your team that's better. And other teams know that there's another guy on your team that's better, and that you're not exactly in the best negotiating position to deal with him because you're pressured by his agent, by the player himself. Because the guy drafted at number 3 is not going to want to be a backup for the entirety of his rookie contract. And Donovan Clingan, as long as Operation Sengun's here, will more than likely be, an overdrafted backup. So to me, at 3, there needs to be at least, a realistic path. Not something defined, because everything changes in the NBA, trades happen, of course. But something natural that doesn't leave you in a pinch in case a move doesn't happen down the line. Is what I would, because we've said we've learned from Rafael Stone, and he said this multiple times, that optionality is the biggest thing for him, right? As a GM. And when you start drafting a guy like Clingan and already having Operation, you're kind of limiting your optionality, and you're making yourself predictable, and being predictable or having only one course of action or a couple of courses of action long term doesn't bode well for negotiations. That makes you want to touch on what I said.
Let me jump in with a couple of things on Clingan, and then I want to transition this back to Reed. So a couple of tidbits I've picked up. We talked on our last pod about Donovan Clingan and Alperen Sengun sharing an agent. I've heard, at least from the Rockets' perspective, that's not a huge deal. It's something that, I don't want to say it's a non-factor, but they're going to treat him the same way they would any other prospect. He is under consideration, and to that point, I've heard that Clingan does plan to work out with the Rockets. I don't know if that's happened just yet. I don't have an exact timetable on that, but this is nothing like either the Rockets or Clingan's camp saying no interest at all. This is a no-go. They are open to this. And part of the rationale, I don't know this is just me speculating, but as I've said a few times, I do think Clingan's role is very projectable. I think he's the type of player and the type of unique body type that I think teams around the league, even if his minutes are capped in the early stages of his career, if he eventually does need to move on to maximize his per minute value, then I think, as opposed to something of a unique prospect where you need to have a long sample, and who knows, as Nathan mentioned earlier, maybe Sengun gets hurt and that happens anyway. But if it doesn't happen, I think Clingan's the type of guy, what he is. And so I think to an extent, not totally, Paolo's points on leverage are fair, but I think it does mitigate the trade concerns just a little bit. Not saying you draft a guy for the intent of trading him. I'm just saying if you do view Clingan as the best player available, I don't think you should take a lesser player simply because that pathway is there for the first 3 years. in a more clear way than it would be for Clingan. Not that there's no path, because again, he can definitely get 15, 20 minutes. It's just beyond that. Yeah, that's a fair question until one of those guys can defend in the perimeter or develops a three-point shot. As far as Reed Sheppard, and this is what I'm curious to see Nathan's take on. So there's been a lot written about how much the analytics models love him. Obviously, he shot above 50% from three at Kentucky. He's the type of guy who has floor spacing that goes beyond the three-point line, really out to 25 plus feet, the type of gravitational pull you hear a lot about in the modern NBA. And so the models love him. A lot of the models have him as the best guy in his class. He had the 42-inch vertical at the combine, yada, yada. At the same time, because he came off the bench, because he played just 1 year at Kentucky, the sample is very small. He's also a smaller guy than usual for a guy that has those skills. So, Nathan, how do you reconcile the analytics for Reed Sheppard with the small sample? How much of it do you buy and how much of it do you take with a grain of salt because he is a little bit smaller and because the sample is a little bit less than you would like?
So I completely buy into the shooting aspect of the game. I don't think there's an argument against him as a shooter, not only because of the percentages, the raw percentages, but also the types of shots that he hit, the fact that he made shots from literally everywhere on the floor. Even if you're looking at him as someone who was able to finish at the basket, no, he didn't pressure the rim a ton, but he certainly made advantage of his shots when he got there. And I think a lot of that is tied to the fact that Reed's very aware of what's going on, and he's also very aware of the player that he is and what he's good at. And he knows exactly what he wants to do, and he knows how to do it on the floor at any given time. If you throw out that very last game of the season for Kentucky out as the outlier, honestly, for both him and Rob Dillingham, and you look at the sample size of the season itself, and you even go back and watch some of the high school tape with Reed, you see someone who has a little more on-ball juice than I think given credit for, just because he didn't get to show it off at higher volume at Kentucky. It doesn't mean it's not there, because when he did get those opportunities, when he did get to take the lion's share of the shots, when he did get to dictate the lion's share of the pick and roll possessions, he was efficient. He found guys, he found shots for himself, and he did have a command over that offense in a way that was different from Rob Dillingham, but in terms of overall impact, was very similar to him. So I do think if you actually go back and watch some of the tape in some of those games, like I said, where he had more opportunity, you'll see everything you want to see in terms of him actually running the floor as a point guard is concerned. So if I'm buying into his pathway as a creator for himself, a creator for others, and a shooter, the most interesting thing, Ben, that you did touch on when we first started to talk about options at the third pick was the defensive aspect of Sheppard. Because he is an undersized player, you talked about how good is he going to be on the ball defensively in the NBA. I think he has good instincts. I think he's got good feet. I think he has quick hands. But there is just an inherent nature of, if you aren't, 6'6" and above at a certain weight class with a certain wingspan, there are going to be guys who you're matched up on who will just figure out ways to get buckets over you or through you. That's just going to happen at the end of the day. Now, the optimistic upside for the Houston Rockets, if Reed Sheppard is the pick, is that they have a bunch of guys behind him who are big, strong, long wings and forwards who can make up a lot of that ground and help him out in those situations. And because you have those guys who are going to be pressuring ball handlers on the ball or capping all their rotations away from the ball, making life difficult for guys to get open or take advantage of certain cutting lanes to the basket, then you have a guy like Reed who has his head on a swivel, understands very much so what his role is defensively, and he's going to be able to capitalize on those mistakes that those other players behind him are able to force. So because of the situation of the Rockets, you're able to mitigate some of those concerns around his primary on-ball, top-the-key defense because of the team's construct. And that's why you just break down every single one of those points individually, Ben. It's very hard for me to argue against Reed being the pick. Again, if you view him in a similar light that I do as a point guard, and you're going to give him that runway to develop. That's why I'm not going to fight Paulo on his pick with third overall. Like I said, I'm very much a Reed Sheppard fan. I think Reed Sheppard can fit on virtually any team in this class, but it's a matter of, with a top 5 pick and the type of value proposition you're expecting from that pick, Are you going to give him the runway to become the best version of himself? If you are, then absolutely take a swing on someone like Reed, because I buy it.
Yeah, I think, as I said, I don't think there's a wrong pick here. There's just picks that I like more than others. You followed me for a long time. You know how it was with.
Oh, Paulo, there's a wrong pick somewhere, man. This draft stuff is hard.
If you took Khalil Ware at pick 3, that would be the wrong pick.
No, that would be the correct.
Oh, jeez.
Listen, we'll get to Khalil Ware eventually, right? Because I've promised Ben we're not going to go a single pod without me asking the guest what's wrong with Khalil Ware, because I kind of see it, but I don't see it to the level of he's not a top 10 pick in this draft. That being said, before we get to Khalil Ware, let's talk a little bit about some of the, less likely guys that the Rockets could take at 3, or, I guess I'll spin it a different way. There's been talk about the Rockets trading back. There's been the Grizzlies at 9. There's been, the Trailblazers, the Blazers at 7 wanting to move up as well. I know you didn't like my mock trade with Simons coming to the Rockets and then pick 3 going to the Blazers. I've tweaked it a bunch, but people still don't like it, so I'll just quit on that.
We can talk about the trade proposal that I came up with if you want to go down that rabbit hole, because I figured that trade was going to come up at some point.
Wait, let's do it then. Did you have one?
So if you're looking at a potential construction on how that trade could look, right? You're looking at Simons and the 14th pick from Portland, and you're looking at Houston trading one of Steven Adams or Jock Landale. You're picking up Jeff Green's option. You're throwing him in the deal. You're trading Jayshawn Tate, and then it's a pick swap, basically that 3rd for the 14th. And then you probably have to throw in, I have like a 2027 Houston top 5 protected first. That's probably along the lines of what the trade looks like. I'm assuming you probably arrived at a similar machination yourself, Paulo. I think my only argument against you when you said about it, it's not that I don't like the trade, because I do. I'm very high on Anfernee Simons and what he can still be in the NBA. My issue with it is it's primarily a dump for Portland in terms of they're just moving off of Anfernee Simons because they think they're either going to find a better fit or they have other fits on the roster itself. I know you're getting that 3rd pick. You're technically moving up in spots to be able to add another young player to that core. But I just don't see the motivation for Portland doing a trade like that. And that, again, what I laid out and what I've seen you lay out, Paul, like those are likely constructions of what the trade would look like. I just don't see Portland's motivation personally for doing that type of a deal. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe something like that can be in play.
Yeah, I actually expected this to be further apart. I actually would consider the trade that you just laid out, mainly because you were careful enough not to include Nets picks, because and this is a take that people aren't having quite yet, but I think they'll have it as we get closer to or more of those picks eventually cashing in. Which is, the Rockets have their own picks past 2027 like any other team. And we Rockets fans have been used to not having our picks for a long time, or them being shaky because of the Russell Westbrook trade. And my take for a while has been, I'd probably rather trade protected Houston-owned picks from 2027 on than the Brooklyn picks in the next 3 years, because I want to retain the upside with those drafts. And I don't hate your trade. I'll actually consider it. My version of it would be more controversial, because instead of the pick, I was considering perhaps if the Rockets can't come to an extension number, Jalen, and how Portland would value him. And I don't know if they would, because they do have Shaedon Sharpe. It's a similar archetype, and there's a lot of overlap there. And Jalen probably brings a lot of the same reasons that I would think Portland would consider moving on from Simons. But in the end, it's talking about it just as a concept. I've been a Simons fan for a long time. When he hits free agency, he was, I was hoping that Portland would consider a sign and trade or something of the sort. I think he's primed to have, he was behind Lillard, and obviously now there's Scoot Henderson and Shaedon Sharpe and DeAndre Ayton and Jeremy Grant. And I think he's in a little bit of a position, kind of like, not obviously to the same extent, I'm not saying he's going to become an MVP, but what James Harden was with the Thunder before he came to Houston and had, his own team. And I'm not saying Anfernee Simons would have his own team here, but he could bring, he'd be surefire insurance. He wouldn't extend Fred VanVleet past his second year. You wouldn't pick up the team option. He could play a lot of the same role. He long-term fits really well with Amen Thompson. I think him scaled up, both as a scorer and as a playmaker, he has a lot more to show. And it makes sense from the perspective of the Rockets are moving off of the rebuild and into, contention or first playoffs, but eventually contention. And it makes some sense to bet on a guy that I think is at this point proven. He has multiple 20-point per game seasons on efficient shooting, efficient assist turnover ratio, instead of actually, to me, a fairly, not a similar, but a somewhat comparable prospect in Reed Sheppard as far as the spacing goes and being a small guard and what that entails team building wise. You'd be pretty happy if Reed Sheppard became what Anfernee Simons is right now. And so it would make sense for just from a concept standpoint that the Rockets would bet on the guy that's safer at this point, which is obviously Anfernee Simons, and Portland could perhaps be enamored by. Obviously, I don't think he's the guy that they would want. I think they'd want Clingan, but enamored by the upside of someone like Clingan or like Reed Sheppard. And as far as further motivation, I mean, if they are all in on Scoot Henderson and they have no reason to not be all in on Shaedon Sharpe, he's always going to be, a sixth man type of guy. And he's pretty expensive for a sixth man type of guy. Long term, I think he's at $25 million a year. And I don't know, if the value was right and if the Blazers like the guy enough at 3, I could see it happening. And obviously, I'm not doing either of these deals if Khalil Ware is not there at 14. So I'll pass it off with that.
Yeah, I would just add, well, first off, I wouldn't do it because I'm a Jalen Green guy. After seeing what he did in March, I'm bought in enough that unless the delta is massive between what he wants and what the Rockets are willing to give, and quite frankly, even in that scenario, I think there's no harm in waiting until the trade deadline and seeing if what you saw in March is real. Because when you look at what the max figure would be relative to his cap hold, which is the number 2 overall pick, would be over $31 million on your 2025 salary books, there's really not that much downside. And I think you could move him for comparable value later on. So I think there's more upside to Jalen than to Simon. So I would stay the course. But I will say that I think a lot of Rockets fans are thinking too idealistically and not enough practically when it comes to a trade like that, because as we've mentioned a couple of times already, you have a 9-man rotation. So if you bring in Anfernee Simons, who is he going to play over? Who is he going to take minutes from? Where are his shot attempts going to come from? So if you just add Jalen Green, or if you add Anfernee Simons to Jalen Green, then it sounds great on paper, but then in terms of how it actually plays out on the floor, yeah, that's a big question. As opposed to the construction that Paulo put out there, if Jalen Green is a part of it, then at least it's clear where Simons' role would come from. At that point, it's just a question of whether the Rockets would give up Jalen for Simons, who has a couple years left on the deal, but it's not a super long-term deal.
Yeah, just to not make it super outrageous for the fans out there. Perhaps if you include Jalen, then perhaps it's 7 instead of 14 or some different arrangement, right? I was just thinking, because the Rockets have, as you said, so many prospects, if you were to bring a guy that will take a chunk of minutes like Simons, you'd probably have to give up a guy that's going to get a chunk of minutes. If it's Jalen, if it's Jalen, it's Jalen. If it's Dillon Brooks, it's Dillon Brooks. If it's Fred himself in a 3-team trade of some sort. I'm just saying.
Yeah, that was my general point, was that you need to think, where is his role going to come from? Because I've seen a lot of people looking at Simons saying, wow, this is a 20-plus points per game scorer on good efficiency that if you can just add him for pick 3, okay, well, then it's like the Reed Sheppard question on steroids. We were talking with Nathan earlier is, are you going to give Reed the runway to develop? I mean, that's a guy who's 19 years old. Now you're talking about flipping the pick for an accomplished guy in his mid-20s. Where is his role going to come from? Not saying you can't make the argument for it. You can. Anfernee Simons is a good player, but you need to think about this in the context of your current team. And so even if I don't agree with the idea of trading Jalen for Simons, I do respect where you're coming from with the logic of it.
I think in regards to that specific construction, I see where Paolo's coming, where Ben's coming from. I do think if you made that type of move for Simons, though, you're not necessarily looking at him and Jalen to be your answer in the backcourt, because defensively that's going to create a number of different problems. So even if you don't include Jalen in a trade to the Blazers, theoretically, you would probably have to move him in a separate deal, potentially. And so I still think you're running into the same issue. And if you are believing in Jalen Green's upside of what he can be on that scalable number, then yeah, I don't think you're pursuing that type of trade. But that's just figuring out what that hypothetical type of deal would look like. I mean, you're probably looking at him playing over Fred VanVleet, but like, what happens to Fred? I already mentioned the Jalen Green aspect of something like that. You know, then what are you looking at using the 14th pick on, or whatever else? But there's a lot of questions that still stem from that. But it seems like Paolo is pretty dead set on Kel'el Ware as a potential Houston Rocket.
Yeah, and I'm burying that until the end because I really don't think the Rockets are going to be in position to draft Kel'el Ware. And it's funny because somehow Paolo is hating on Donovan Clingan because of Alveren Sengun, but he is keeping himself open to the Kel'el Ware possibility, although I will concede that Ware does move his feet on the perimeter a bit better than Donovan Clingan does. On the other hand, I could also point to Christian Wood, Paolo's favorite player, as a template for Kel'el Ware, although I know he'll shut anyone down who dares to say that, so we'll table that for the very end. As far as more reasonable trade down scenarios, which I don't think would be for Kel'el Ware. So we mentioned Memphis at 9. That's been rumored a few places. Portland at 7 or 14. I'm curious your thoughts, Nathan, on potential trade down targets for the Rockets if they do move down a few slots in the lottery. Like, I'm looking at your mock draft, and this is, as mentioned earlier, guys, that you're personally higher on than the consensus. You've got Buzelis, Ron Holland, Stephon Castle, guys that you're a little higher on than some. Maybe one of those guys, Holland in particular, someone who seems to be falling, at least in the consensus mocks that I've seen. So maybe he's a target later on, and he's someone who, you know, the Rockets have talked about that they're not afraid to put a guy in the G League for a little bit if they feel they need to, because they do have a crowded rotation already. We saw them do that in the first half of last season with Cam Whitmore, who proved that you just couldn't hold him down there. He was ready sooner than they expected. And so eventually he pushed his way into the rotation. And, you know, if you have too many good players, that's ultimately a good problem to have. Worst case, you can make a trade later on, as we talked about during the Clingan hypothetical. But in these scenarios where the Rockets might move down a few slots, who are some guys that you think are, you know, good or bad fits? And, you know, I mentioned the 3 that you're a little higher on that could be a target if they move back a few slots. I'll mention someone that I'm a little hesitant on, even though I think he would fit the need. I would worry about Dalton Connect with the Rockets simply because he's a guy who's 23 years old, ready to play now, and yet the Rockets don't really have a clear role for a rookie that they're going to bring in. And if they just want shooting, as mentioned earlier, you can get a guy like that with the MLE. So as far as developing the other aspect of Dalton's game, I don't really know that he's a fit, especially as someone that is 23 years old, needs to play right now. I don't know that the Rockets are the best fit for him. A guy like Buzelis or Holland, perhaps there's a fit in Houston because, again, there's more optionality. You can sort of develop them on a longer time frame. That's just my initial thoughts. Nathan, as far as trade down scenarios, is there anyone that you're particularly drawn to or against when it comes to fitting with the Rockets?
Well, you talked about the 3 guys that I'm higher than consensus on. If we're talking about fits with the Rockets out of those 3, I'm probably the biggest Stephon Castle fan, and I have been for the majority of this cycle. I feel like I was on an island along with some of my former No Ceilings teammates, staying high on Stephon Castle for a lot of the cycle, but it proved out, right? He's a 6'6" jumbo guard / decent sized wing, someone who compares favorably physically to someone like a Jimmy Butler. I know their games are different right now, but when you take a look at Castle, I get it. The concern's going to be there in terms of the shooting, and you have that shooting concern with any of those 3 names. You can have them with the number of the players who would be picked after those 3 names as well. But when you look at Castle, he does so many other things while on the floor that you just can't ignore, right? His perimeter, his on-ball defense is superb. Not necessarily creating a lot of deflections and looking to create a lot of turnovers to get out in transition, but in terms of his no-nonsense, I'm going to keep you in front of me defense, I'm not going to let you get a good shot. You're either taking a tough shot over me or you're kicking the ball to somebody else, which is potentially opening up the hole for one of those other guys on the Rockets that we're talking about, these other big wings to capitalize on some of those turnover opportunities. I think he would fit really well defensively at the point of attack alongside some of the options for the Houston Rockets. He offers playmaking ability, right? You saw him operate in the pick and roll game, develop a really strong two-man game with Clingan. I could see him and Şengün being really fun dance partners at the NBA level. And then if you do start to break down some of the scoring, good finisher at the rim, underrated athlete, someone who can go up off 2 feet and catch a lob or cut to the basket, finish well around the rim. He gained a lot more confidence later in the season in terms of pull-up jump shooting and stepping into some of those spot-up looks that he took on the wing. And that confidence is a big part in his shooting aspect, along with the fact that as the year went on, he kept getting better and better and better and better from the free throw line. And then he saw him walk up to the NBA draft combine and knock a lot of his shooting drills out of the park. So it's someone who, again, you don't have the large sample size of shooting success in college, but you do have someone who at the very least was more and more willing to take those shots as the year went on. And now it seems like he was very much so aware of that part of his game. He even spoke about it before the combine even started, was very self-aware. This is something I need to be able to show. This is something I need to be able to work on. I'm going to do it. That's the type of belief I have in myself. And I have full confidence that he will at the very least not be someone who ends up in like the 27% range from three. I think he's going to end up somewhere in that 33, 34, 35% range from three as his career goes on. And if he's that much of a threat with all of the other positive things that he brings to the table, I didn't even mention his rebounding as a guard/wing, his screen setting ability as a guard/wing. If you put all these other positive things together, I know the fit may not be the quote-unquote cleanest in terms of, well, what's he going to do for the Houston Rockets from day one? But just having a guy like that on your roster who you can go to war with, and he's going to show up in these high-leverage situations and play his best basketball as a guy who fills a position of need, a position that everyone's looking for around the NBA, these bigger guards who can masquerade as wings defensively and guard up the lineup and scale up. That's the type of player, if he would be available in a trade down scenario, absolutely I'd look at someone like Castle.
Yeah, once again, I guess in this draft cycle, Ben knows the guys that I like, so he asks about the guys that I don't like. Listen, it's not that I don't like Castle, it's that I don't like Castle for the Rockets. And specific, as you said, the fit's not the greatest. I see in him a lot of the same traits that I expect on them to have as a point guard moving forward. Obviously, different players. But a lot of the same weaknesses as well. And I think it is a Raphael Stone quote. It's not that you don't want to stack strengths, it's that you don't want to stack weaknesses, right? I think he said this in the past draft, but do you recall?
No, he did. Or I think it was during this season, but yeah, that's a Raphael Stone quote. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you don't want to stack weaknesses, Stephon Castle and Amen Thompson stack a lot of weaknesses. That being said, moving on to my favorite topic of every podcast the last 3 weeks and on to the next 2 weeks, Khalil Ware. First of all, I need to answer these Christian Wood allegations because they're absolutely outrageous. I see some of the motor concerns. I also see that as opposed to Christian Wood, who I would be scared to death of taking out on a walk because if it becomes too windy and he wears a baggy coat, he may just fly with the wind. No, Khalil Ware is heavier, stronger, thicker. He plays, he is not as scared of contact as Christian Wood is. You can see by, just functional strength just by looking at the post moves, right? Fading away, you can't fade, you can't fade away from the post if you don't get a little bit of separation, if you're not strong enough to, first inflict the head and then fade away, right? Christian Wood did not have any post moves other than kind of those weird up and under then into floater type of things because he couldn't absorb any contact. You can see Khalil Ware absorb contact at the college level already, and so I don't think he'll have a lot of the Christian Wood issues defensively, as far as motor goes, were compounded by the fact that he did not have the tools whatsoever to guard anybody other than Reed Sheppard on the post. So that's the first thing that I want to touch on. Listen, I see the motor concerns. Do you think, I don't know where I did not check where you have him in your mock, Nathan, but what am I missing? I'm seeing a guy that can shoot. I'm seeing a guy that can rim protect. I'm seeing a guy that's mobile, that has a frame that he can fill into, that has, some footwork, some coordination, that has really soft touch on floaters and even his shot. Shooting form, the percentage served at on low volume, the shot doesn't look broken. What am I missing for in such a weak draft with such low, superstar upside swings for this guy not to be one of the top 10 guys being taken? What am I missing?
Nathan has him at 17, by the way.
So with Kalu, I think a lot of the, let's call it intel-related concerns from last cycle may have potentially been a bit overblown by the end of this particular cycle, in the sense of, it's not a secret. There were some things that came out about Kalu regarding his last situation. Jonathan Gaboni reported on that for ESPN. So I'm not breaking any news here, nor do I ever want to share intel as a reporter, because I am not a reporter. I usually don't talk about those kinds of things a lot on podcasts, but those concerns were there. I have not heard anything negatively on Kalu this cycle. As I talked about Corey Tullivan, I talked about him on a No Ceilings podcast episode. So I think a lot of that's been overblown as of right now, June 12th, 2024. But in terms of where people, I think, are disappointed in his game, I think when people look at the tape, they want to see a little more from him. And what I mean by that, you can tie it to motor. That can be the word that you use. But when you take a look at the things that you would expect a big man, areas for a big man to dominate in, he had good but not excellent offensive rebounding numbers. He had good but not excellent block numbers. I agree with you. He certainly had highlights shooting the basketball. I love how Paulo was going to the post fadeaways. That's something he's shown. He's knocked down some open spot up threes. A lot of the shooting stuff, it's been built for him as a definitive skill, but a lot of the people who question some of these other shooters based on low volume and low sample size, it's been low volume and low sample size for Kalu as well, and he's never been this consistent, 75, 80% plus free throw shooter from the line as well, to suggest that he's going to come into the NBA and he's going to effectively space the floor for it. I still think NBA defenses are going to want to make sure that he can definitively hit that shot. And there's going to be moments where they leave him open and they test him on that jump shot a little bit. I don't think anyone's going to immediately from day one try to hard close out on Ware from the perimeter. So those are the negative things for him. But Paulo also pointed out a lot of the positives where he makes sense, right? He's a 7-foot, legitimate athletic big man. He can run the floor, finish lobs. We talked about his potential spacing ability, but he was a dominant defensive rebounder in the second half of Indiana's season, and that's something I know the Houston Rockets could definitely use some more of. So he is a change-up pitch in his own way, in the sense that he's not like Alperen Şengün. He's someone who you can bring off the bench, and it's a different type of look at the 5. I know why Paulo wants to say that those two can play minutes together. I'm not sure that I want to play those 2 minutes together anyways, to be perfectly honest with you. I see Ware more as a 5. I think if you slide him down to the 4, I think you're going to be asking for trouble in different ways. But if you see him as a backup 5-man, someone who can provide a change of pace for you off the bench, someone who sparingly can play minutes with Şengün easier than someone like Clingan can, for example, I understand the argument for taking someone like Ware. I honestly haven't wrestled with successfully the ideas myself of I want to see more from Ware on the tape, because he does give me those moments too where I'm watching him and I'm like, how many guys in the draft can actually do something like this? But then there's all these other little possessions that it may just be nitpicking, where I'd want to see him crash the glass a little harder, or I'd want to see him rotate a little harder, or I'd see him want to drop back and recover and block a shot at the rim that maybe he could have gotten. It's those plays that we know he's talented enough to make, but he doesn't make them on the tape. And that's why you hear a lot of the motor stuff. That's why some of the concern stuff bubbles back. But if we're just evaluating Ware as a raw talent in this class, Ben, I mean, I do think he's a top 10 talent in this class. It's just a matter of, are you going to get that guy consistently on a night-to-night basis playing up to his potential? And that's why, you say a name like Christian Wood. I know Paulo wants to just spit that out and throw it in the trash, but that's why you hear some of those things around Ware's name, because you've seen some of it on tape. You've read all the stuff about some behind-the-scenes stuff last year. That's just naturally part of the draft discourse. That's what's going to come up and come out at this time of the year. We're like 2 weeks away from the draft. So
yeah,
I understand Paulo's argument. I just don't know if I'm taking him above like the 13th or the 14th or all the way down to, I had him like 17th to the Lakers. I think he's lower than that on my big board. I just think there's other bets at other positions that I personally would rather make than Ware. But I see the argument. A lot of people have stood up and have been talking about Ware over the last few weeks. I understand why.
Yeah. All right, let me throw in one more question, and we can make this quick. So our last guest in the pod, Dave Hardesty of Clutch Fans, made a really compelling argument that fans should be thinking less about fit with the current roster when it comes to this pick for the Rockets and more about fit with Ime Udoka. And there's a few reasons for that, but most notably, the Rockets are going into a period where there may be more upheaval with the roster that I think fans are accustomed to during phase one of the rebuild. As you get into the second contracts, there's a need for consolidation. You're probably not going to be able to pay all of these guys. So the facts are you're probably not going to have the same roster 2-3 years from now when it comes to the entirety of the young core. Right now, a core 6 could be a core 7 if you keep this pick. And so because of that, it's less about how they fit day one, and it's more about fit with the culture, the scheme, what Ime Udoka is trying to build. So with that in mind, I think the traits of Ime Udoka that are pretty clear from his year in Boston, his first year with the Rockets, I think what most people would say about an Ime Udoka-led team, they're known for defense, they're known for toughness, they're known for high IQ. I think that is what he wants his team to be. And so when you look at this draft through that lens, two guys that pop to me are the two Connecticut guys, Donovan Clingan and Stephon Castle, that have a lot of those traits. High IQ, they're mentally and physically tough. They defend at a high level. Is there anyone else, when you look at the lottery tier prospects that could be in play at 3, or if the Rockets were to hypothetically trade down a few slots in one of these constructions we've thrown out over the last hour or so, is there anyone beyond Clingan or Castle that could fit that mold as far as being a fit, not necessarily with the Rockets roster, but a fit with what Ime Udoka envisions his team eventually being when they're a contender a few years from now?
I mean, first of all, that logic, you can't disagree with it, right? I mean, I know that I was one person who wanted to slam that Rockets over this past season of 31.5 wins, and they got the 41-41. They wouldn't have done that without a lot of what Ime Udoka was able to bring to the table from a philosophical standpoint, from a schematic standpoint, defensively. They wouldn't have been able to mold the young talent that they do and actually grow this type of winning culture that can hopefully produce some playoff level success in this year and in years to come. So in trying to draft and build a team around that mindset, we talked about those two guys you mentioned in Ben. I'm fans of them both. But if you're going to trade down, I don't think you can ignore someone like Devin Carter either, right? Devin Carter is going to bring a lot of the same things to the table. Tough, scrappy, defensive-minded guard, certainly an NBA-level athlete, legitimate wingspan when he's defending out on the perimeter. He's another guy who can create deflections, was one of the best guard shot blockers that we have in this draft class. The Rockets rated 21st in terms of block percentage of this past year, so that's certainly an area that they can improve upon, not just around the basket for talking about Şengün's deficiencies, but certainly elsewhere. I mean, they missed Tari Eason in a lot of these lineups this past year. And if you can
Absolutely.
get, similar levels of impact at the guard position, at the point of attack, and playing some of the similar lanes, and then you have some of these other guys to support him behind him, why wouldn't you look at someone like Devin Carter? I mean, I think the biggest thing for me that I was hung up on during the draft process and why I wasn't among this initial wave of scouts and analysts who wanted to just shove them up near the top of their boards, I was skeptical on the jump shooting and specifically the touch with him. Like he'll get himself caught on some drives and he'll have to resort to like a fadeaway or like a tough leaner. And he won't have like that shooter soft touch to actually get that shot to go. It's not just about the 3-point inconsistencies that he had before this season. He's got that moonball of a shot, but he seems confident with it. I think I at least trust him to hit enough of those spot-up threes. He's the type of athlete who wants to go up at the rim and finish over guys, so I don't necessarily worry a ton about his at-rim finishing. It's those in-between areas, but if you're subscribing to the modern NBA systems of it's just threes and layups and dunks, baby, like, and then you're throwing in what he's going to give you defensively and how he comes from a pro pedigree and a background, yeah, if you're trading down, Devin Carter has to be one of the names on the list you're looking at.
Good stuff. Folks, that is Nathan Grubel, who you can follow at Draft Deeper on Twitter. As far as upcoming content from you, you mentioned a few of your projects earlier, but I'm guessing the simplest way for fans and our listeners to keep tabs is just through that Draft Deeper Twitter page, correct?
So absolutely follow me on Twitter at Draft Deeper. I'm very active. I'm still sharing my big board, my mock drafts through there up through this draft cycle. And then next season, I will be launching a new project called Youth Movement NBA. It will be a newsletter that will be coming out. Stay tuned for more about that. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll get all the information about that when the time is right.
Perfect. All right. Well, I think that's where we can wrap things for today's episode. And for us at the Logger Line, if you want more content before our next show from Paulo or myself, the best place to get that is online, where you can follow Paulo on Twitter or X at PauloAlvesNBA, me on there at Ben Dubose, and the show at the Logger Line. And if you go to the Logger Line's Twitter/X page, you can find our link tree, which has all the links to our distribution partners like Apple, Google, and Spotify. If you'd be kind enough to subscribe, leave a positive review at your location of choice, we'd greatly appreciate it. Also on that same link tree, you can find links to our friends, sponsors, partners of the program, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790. Hit up those links and you can enjoy their content as well. All right, with those plugs complete, we will adjourn for today. For Paulo and Nathan, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.